Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Today's a first for our noon book reviews. We have our first volunteer reviewer. JJ was walking around the library and he had the book and he goes, "This would be a great book for a noon book review. Why don't you get somebody?" I said, "All right, let me see what I can do." But he showed up about a week later. He goes, "Did you get anybody yet?" I go, "Well, no, not yet." He goes, "Well, I'll do it." So he made my job easier this month. So JJ is the past president of the Civil War Roundtable, member of the Civil War Trust, Friends of the Ulysses S. Grant Cottage, the Major General Winfield Scott Hancock Society, and Friends of Gettysburg. So here's JJ to tell us about My Thoughts Be Bloody, the bitter rivalry between Edwin and John Wilkes Booth that led to an American tragedy. So. Let me get on this.
I have to excuse my $1.08 specials. These things happen, right, as the numbers increase. I was telling the cameraman, I was wondering if I was going to clash with all of this in the background, but he told me he might have to get me a hat, so we'll have to go with that. Just out of curiosity, and I promise not to throw you out if you answer in the negative, how many read the book? Attaboy, that's a good man. All right, well then you can help me. I've always felt that a book review is a lot like a restaurant review and extraordinarily subjective. You're reading a classic and I think it's a comic book. We go to one of those fine 4-star restaurants and I'm looking for the meat and the potatoes. So it really depends on the individual as to whether or not you like a book. But in addition to whether or not you like this book, you're going to have to decide whether or not you agree with her conclusions. And that, boys and girls, is two completely different areas that we're going to need to discuss. Having read this thing twice, cover to cover, the first time I read it, I was shocked. So the second time I read it, I did my homework first. And my homework consisted of all I could possibly read about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln from other sources, because the event itself is not touched in great detail here. She has a different avenue of approach. So if you need to understand what happened to Abraham Lincoln, besides the obvious, getting shot, you need to get that from different sources. You won't get it from here. What this talks about, I'll explain to you in just a minute. The second area of homework, which came as a big surprise to me, because I had to go back to my senior year in high school, as I had to restudy Shakespeare. Shakespeare takes a huge, huge part of the life of the Booth family. And you have to understand Shakespeare in order to understand the Booths. Shakespeare is quoted extensively in this book, not the least of which is the start of every chapter. There's a quote from Shakespeare. "My thoughts be bloody" is a quote from Shakespeare. You go straight to the head of the class if you know which play that came from without looking it up. Hamlet. Atta girl. Good for you. But you need to know the plot lines of Shakespeare. You don't necessarily have to learn dialogue like you're going on the stage with the Booths. You have to know the plots. You need to know Othello, Antony and Cleopatra, Richard II and III, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, Hamlet, and most definitely Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar dominates the life of John Wilkes Booth, and his life was only 26 years. But these things were huge in the life of the Booth family. Shakespeare kept them fed. Shakespeare kept them alive, and they just lived Shakespeare. And so you have to know your Shakespeare in order to appreciate what Nora Titone is talking about. Now, once you've completed your homework, we move to the book. Now, if you've ever been in a court of law, or if you've ever seen a good Law and Order episode, you understand the term opening arguments. Opening arguments is when Assistant District Attorney Jack McCoy stands in front of the jury and lays out the entire case from the start, and then spends the rest of the time filling in the gaps, filling in the details. And as you know, the devil is in the details. Okay? And that's what she does here. She lays this case out for you from the start, from the beginning. The entire case is laid out almost from the title of the book, The Bitter Rivalry Between Edwin and John Wilkes Booth That Led to an American Tragedy. Then you go to the dust cover. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. It simply says, the scene of John Wilkes Booth shooting Abraham Lincoln in Ford's Theater is the most vivid and indelible images in American history. The literal story of what happened on April 14th is familiar. Lincoln was killed by John Wilkes Booth, yet who Booth really was, besides a killer, is less well known. The magnitude of his crime has obscured for generations a startling personal story that was integral to his motivation. Motivation. The police department, when they investigate a murder scene, talk about means, motive, and opportunity. The means here are quite obvious. The President of the United States was shot in the back of the head at point-blank range. The opportunity is obvious. John Wilkes Booth knew this theater like the back of his hand. He worked there. He got his mail there. He even set the place up on Friday morning in anticipation of the assassination. His opportunity is obvious. So that leaves motive. Why? Now, I don't care if you have a GED or a PhD in American Civil War. We have been taught since we were this high that John Wilkes Booth was a Southern sympathizer, even possibly an agent. He was striking a blow for the Confederacy against the evil tyrant and throw in a little white supremacy for good measure. And this is what we have been taught for over 100 years. And Nora Titone says we have missed the larger picture. The larger picture. Now, I got to be honest with you, gang. I thought that the larger picture was the assassination of the President of the United States. And she says no. She said that Mr. Lincoln, and uses the phrase in the book, was a bloody prop, and that the motivation had very little to do with Mr. Lincoln. The motivation was the relationship, or lack of, between the actors Edwin and John Wilkes Booth. And the family dynamics contributes more of a percentage to the assassination of the president than the politics. Now, I got to tell you, that's extraordinary. Okay? This to me is a game changer. This is a tour de force. This is the greatest case of sibling rivalry since Cain and Abel. If you accept her evidence and her conclusions. And that goes back to what I said before. A, do you like the book? And B, do you agree with her? Now, we've all talked in the historical community about the need to have a fresh light on an old subject. We want to hear something new. I mean, how many books can you read about Gettysburg, right? Well, be careful what you wish for, because this is extraordinary. Now, interestingly, I found myself with two dominant thoughts as I read this book for the second time. And incredible as it may seem, there was a sense of anxiety. Now, the question I had to ask myself when I realized this is, how is that possible? You know how this is going to turn out. The man is going in the box. The man is going to shoot the President of the United States, and there's not a whole heck of a lot anybody can do about it. And yet, I think the quality of the writing is such that there were moments in this book when you just wanted to reach through the pages or reach through the prism of time and throttle somebody. Never mind John Wilkes. That goes without saying. You want to get to the brother, Edwin, his older brother, who treated him badly. There's no other way to put it. He just treated him badly. And anxiety is difficult to explain in the context of a historical document. And those of you who have read history know exactly what I'm talking about, because you know how it's going to end. And yet this constant rejection, Edwin's constant failure to support his brother in the most minute way, contributes, according to Nora Titone, mightily to the assassination of the president. Now, I'm by no means Dr. Phil, but I got to tell you, there were moments in this book when John Wilkes Booth could have used a hug. Now, the problem with John Wilkes Booth is he is supported mightily by the women in his life, his mother and his sister, and he gets no support from the male side, including Edwin, again and again and again. The failure of Edwin to support his brother is huge. Now, the second thought, or emotion, if you will, is a sense of sadness. And it's not that Mr. Lincoln was assassinated. That's perfectly understood. That's what mathematicians called a given. Perfectly understandable that Mr. Lincoln's shooting is sad. The sadness, I think, comes from a category of unintended consequences. I don't know if she intended to do this, but Miss Titone has diminished Mr. Lincoln's death. Not his life. His life is understood. It's an open book. We know all there is to know about it. But I'm talking about his death. Once again, going back to that GED or PhD, we've all been taught since we were this high, Mr. Lincoln died for the cause. If I may steal from the Battle Hymn of the Republic, Jesus died to make men holy. Mr. Lincoln died to make men free. Glory, glory, hallelujah. For all intents and purposes, even though you can get into the trivia game, but for all intents and purposes, he is the last Union casualty of the Civil War. It all crashes down with the assassination of Mr. Lincoln. Now, as students of the Civil War, we know that in August of '64, Mr. Lincoln was convinced he wasn't even going to get reelected. But then Sherman took Atlanta, and in November of '64, Mr. Lincoln was reelected. He got 55% of the popular vote. The landslide was on the electoral side. But the popular vote, 55%, is swayed by over 86% of the soldiers in the field voting for Mr. Lincoln. His second inauguration in March, and he's martyred in April, and he ascends. He becomes deified. The religious significance of him being shot on Good Friday is not lost on anybody, okay? And he would be horrified at this deification. But no matter what, we all thought, and we all still think, he died for a reason. The Union, emancipation, glory, hallelujah. And along comes Nora Titone and says, maybe not. That the whole thing, the whole business is two actors vying for stage, two brothers vying for their dead father's mantle. Now, granted, you cannot dismiss the politics. You cannot ignore the politics of the era. But what she is saying is that is purely icing on the cake. Now, this is anecdotal. I don't know if she said it, but I almost wish she had. But supposedly, Jackie Kennedy said after Dallas that she had hoped that Jack had died for civil rights rather than at the hands of a silly little communist, which is what she called Lee Harvey Oswald. Why? What was she looking for? She was looking for a reason for his death. She wanted it to mean something, not somebody stacking books at $1.25 an hour who happened to have a $13 rifle. She wanted significance. Well, we have the significance with Mr. Lincoln. We know the significance. Emancipation, Union. Well, sorry, maybe not. And that's sad. That really is sad. And I don't know that that's what she intended to do. One of the things I do appreciate that she did do in this book is she takes John Wilkes Booth down several notches. We are all guilty. We are all guilty of putting John Wilkes Booth on a pedestal. He gets a place in history, frankly, he doesn't deserve. Okay? He just flat out doesn't deserve it. First of all, there's this huge myth that John Wilkes Booth is the great actor. John Wilkes Booth was not a great actor. John Wilkes Booth wasn't even a good actor. John Wilkes Booth was an action figure. John Wilkes Booth was the Chuck Norris against Anthony Hopkins, is the only similarity I can come up with, okay? Secondly, John Wilkes Booth is a cad, especially when it comes to women. He uses people and he throws them away. He's running a cult. Now, you and I, when we consider cults, we consider David Koresh in Waco or Jim Jones in Guyana. Now, John Wilkes Booth is running a cult. With the exception of Dr. Mudd, there isn't a triple-digit IQ in this crowd. And he dominates these people with his charm and his sex appeal, and he makes them do things that if they had given it some thought, they probably wouldn't have done. But he was a charmer, but he's a cad. He's also a horrible businessman. This business that John Wilkes Booth had all of this kind of money, he had blown through money like you and I go through socks. He'd invested in oil wells in western Pennsylvania that had come up dry. And he was broke at the time of the assassination. So we have put him on this pedestal. We've created an image, and we're all guilty of it, of who John Wilkes Booth was. And he was not. And for that, I do appreciate the work that Mrs. Titone has done. Now, there are dozens of vignettes, stories, if you will, that go through this book about the relationship between John and Edwin, this constant keeping him at arm's length, refusing to support his career. Edwin Booth, who we have all forgotten, is one of the great, powerful men of the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he has disappeared from the annals of history, which is exactly what John Wilkes Booth wanted to do. He wanted to usurp his brother. He wanted to upstage his brother. And he succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. No one remembers Edwin. Anytime Edwin Booth is mentioned, it's always in the context of Edwin Booth, brother of the assassin of the president, John Wilkes Booth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, down the line. Edwin was the man. And John Wilkes Booth wanted to be the man. And he took it away from him. Now, I could go through various stories. We could discuss the different instances, but then you wouldn't read the book. Nora Titone would be mad at me. Her publisher would be mad at me. Her little kid who hopes to go to college based on the profits of this book would be mad at me. So we're not going to do that. Okay? We're not going to do that. I highly recommend this book. Highly recommend this book if you want to increase your knowledge of the events about the Lincoln assassination. One thing that dominated the thoughts of John Wilkes Booth was the play Julius Caesar. He thought of himself as Brutus. He's been described as Brutus in a recent assassination book, American Brutus, John Wilkes Booth and the assassination of President Lincoln. And he thought of himself as Brutus striking a blow against Julius Caesar, the evil tyrant. Of course, he conveniently forgets that Brutus ends up dead at the end of the play, but that was something he, I guess, was willing to take a chance on. But in the final analysis, even though the play Julius Caesar dominates, I come back to Hamlet. I come back to that famous, famous speech of Hamlet, to be or not to be. That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache, and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished for, to die, to sleep perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. Thank you very much. I'm dying for your questions. Come on, jump in there. Yeah, oh yeah. I'll repeat the question. Yes, ma'am.
Did it take you longer to read it the second time because you kept comparing it to the first, or why read it other than this talk the second time?
It took me longer the second time because I had to get my Hamlet and my Julius Caesar and all my Cliff Notes. And I had to refer to as I said before, each chapter starts with a quote from Shakespeare, and she follows that theme throughout that chapter. And of course, you know how Shakespeare talks, and sometimes it's a little tough for 21st century males to understand anything of what's going on. But when you read it, and then you realize where she's going, and you have to remember her focus is very narrow. Motivation. She's not going out. Azerat, Surat, Harold, all of those guys barely get a mention. Barely get a mention. She's not interested in them. She's staying focused on his motivation, what drove him to that stage, to that box. And she stumbled, according to stories that I've read on the internet. She doesn't answer her emails. I've sent her a dozen. But according to stories I have read, she stumbled upon this purely by accident. She's a research assistant for Doris Kearns Goodwin, who wrote the introduction. Okay, and after they were done with Team of Rivals, they did that famous line where they're sitting around and somebody said, "What's next?" And somebody said, "You know, no one's ever done a biography of Edwin Booth." And she said, "Well, let me look into it." And she just took off. And she got into the papers, and there's a treasure trove of papers. There's biographies written. There's letters. These people were prolific letter writers. And she just stumbled on this and established in her own mind, and then presents it to us, that the assassination of Abraham Lincoln is just a prop. The man's a bloody prop. That this whole thing is to dominate his brother. And my goodness, doesn't he succeed? Nobody knows Edwin. I knew nothing about Edwin Booth. I just knew he existed, but always in the context of Edwin Booth, brother of John Wilkes Booth, assassin of Abraham Lincoln. And you just go from there. And Edwin was the man. Edwin was making $6,000 for 5 nights of Hamlet in 1864, and then again in 1874. Hey, that's some decent coin now. In those days, he was the man. And one thing I did know, I knew the father. I knew of the father. I didn't know him that well. He was dead long before I got here. But I knew of the father, Junius Brutus Booth. I'm telling you, what a handle. But his biggest problem, he was a genius. He speak fluently 7 languages by the time he was like 14. He could read a script one time and have it memorized and go out on the stage. He was an extraordinary actor. He was a genius. But as you know, there's a very fine line between genius and insanity. And Junius worked very hard at erasing that line. And you throw the fact in, he drank like a fish. He wasn't married to the mother of the children. He had a wife and kid back in London that he was hiding. I mean, they don't live a soap opera. They live a Shakespearean play. They live a tragedy. And that's one of the biggest problems for this whole family, is the inability to separate reality from the stage. And it doesn't take much of a leap. It's only 12 feet from that box to the floor. But it doesn't take much of a leap to see how John Wilkes Booth, at the age of 26, he's very young, he's impressionable, and he's furious. He's furious that he cannot achieve the greatness that his brother has. And he wants it bad. He can taste it. One thing leads to another. Yes, ma'am.
Did the sons know their father?
Yes. Yes. They all grew up in Baltimore. And then the father moved them out of Baltimore, out of sight, out of mind, because he was not married to the mother, also to get away from the cholera. And he built a place outside of Baltimore. And they had their own little existence. They had their own little life for many, many years. And what did they do? They acted. Shakespeare was everything to them. Shakespeare kept them fed. The father used to say, I want you kids to go and get a craft. Do something else. Be a plumber. Of course, who am I kidding? There are no plumbers in those days. Be an electrician. There's no electricians in those days. Do something other than the theater. Impossible. Impossible in that environment for those kids not to become actors. The oldest son, Junius Jr., becomes an actor. He's not so good. And he runs away to California. He gets out of that madhouse. But Edwin and Brutus, listen to this. Edwin and John Wilkes, okay, are doing plays with their friends when they're 12 and 8. They set up a basement in Baltimore. They steal scenery, and they steal tables, and they charge admission, and they give the guy $1 who owns the basement. And they're running plays at the age of 12 and 8, because this is all they know. This is their environment. So, somebody, no, yes, no. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
At the beginning of your talk, I was so reminded of the Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, that here also was a young man who was very angry at what life had given to him, of his circumstances, and he finally goes out and kills his landlady, almost just to reach out. I have to do something to right the wrong that has been done to me. And the whole thing from there is a story of his guilt and finally, all of the things that happen to him as he works through this. And finally, I think you sort of get the feeling at the end that he sort of understands what he did was wrong. But the analogy of a young man trying to right the wrongs that have been done to him by his family, circumstances, whatever they are, it's so similar. It makes me believe that this lady's on the right track. I have not read this book. Repeat the question.
She was discussing Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, about the whole relationship between striking out at the injustices of the world, and she really didn't ask a question. But hey, don't worry about it. That's fine. That's fine. That's no problem with that at all. One thing, never mind. Lost that thought. Come back to something else. Yes, sir.
I think all of us have some mental health problems.
Sure.
All of us, are not 100%
Absolutely.
healthy.
Absolutely.
Also, all of us who have siblings have gone through sibling rivalry.
Absolutely.
Right. My question is whether or not the author considered, most of us, almost all of us, with our mental health problems and dealing with, being ignored and mistreated by siblings, we would attack the sibling. We would not attack the mayor of the city or the governor of New York or the president of the United States. And therefore, I think what you said initially about his believing in slavery and believing in the rights of the South were predominant. I think that's has far greater truth than the author's opinion that the Civil War had nothing to do with this assassination. This assassination was caused entirely by emotional problems and sibling rivalry.
Okay, now, if I let you,
Did she ever consider that in her book?
if I led you to believe that the sibling rivalry is the sole cause of the assassination, then that's my fault. What I'm saying is, what she's saying is that's the basis.
That's what she's
Okay,
arguing.
she's saying it's the basis and that the tipping point could easily be the assassination of the president. That's what puts him over the edge. Okay, let me play devil's advocate and just defend the position for just a moment. Why does he shoot the president of the United States in the theater? Okay, now, supposedly, there is a long story that John Wilkes Booth heard a speech by Abraham Lincoln on Sunday when they found out that Lee had surrendered, and that Lincoln had talked about suffrage for the African Americans who had fought. And he turned to the man standing next to him and said, that's the last speech he'll make. I'm going to run him through. Okay? And that's because of the white supremacy, which is the point you're making. Okay? The argument that she's going to make, she doesn't necessarily make it, is why does he wait till Friday? You can get into the White House with a pass. Okay? In those days, access was easy. You show your business card, John Wilkes Booth, the actor, he goes to the front of the line, walks up to what is now the Lincoln bedroom, was then the Lincoln office, shoots him dead on the spot, and goes out the second floor window and makes his escape. But he doesn't. He waits till Friday when he finds out that Lincoln is coming to the theater. And that's when he sets up the box so that he can shoot the President of the United States in the theater. And the reason, you're absolutely right. You're on a good track. I don't disagree with you. But what she's going to tell you is the reason he does that in the theater is for his brother. To show his brother, I'm a better actor. I'm a better performer than you are. That's a hell of a leap from sibling rivalry to putting a .44 caliber pistol shot in the back of a man's head.
Committing a crime does not establish acting aptitude.
Absolutely. Absolutely. He wasn't a very good actor.
But he didn't prove anything.
Well,
He didn't prove he was a better actor. And he did not quote upstage his older brother.
oh, absolutely he did. No one knows anything about it.
He did. If the word upstage means get publicity, yes. But if the word upstage means to perform better on stage, he did not upstage his brother.
All right. All right. I'll agree with that.
Yeah.
I'll agree with that. But his purpose, I don't think, was to necessarily, his purpose, according to her, his purpose is to just exceed whatever stature his brother has achieved.
And my statement to the author is, with his mental health problem, he should have gone after his brother rather than going after an elected official.
Nora, Oh, darn. Well, don't forget to play Julius Caesar. Don't forget to play Julius Caesar. Who does Brutus kill? Brutus kills Caesar. Okay, so everything is in the context of the theater. She talks about this at the end of the book, that everything in this is in the context of the theater. Yes, ma'am. Sir.
Are you aware of the book that was published within the last year, and I forget the title and the author, but it traces Lincoln's journey from Springfield all the way to Washington and how he slips through Baltimore.
The Baltimore, I think it's the Baltimore plot. Might
Right.
be called the Baltimore plot.
That might be.
Yeah.
But anyway, but he makes a case that Booth was playing in Albany
Yes, he was
the
here.
week before.
He was here in February.
And he developed this idea at that time. That's the author of that book says. And actually that Booth had organized the thugs in Baltimore to try to knock him off on the way in. So this thesis is somewhat at odds with this author.
It certainly is. Booth was in charge of the Baltimore riots that, or the attempt to assassinate, to talk of assassinating the president. Really? Okay, we're going to find out one. We're going to find out one. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm with Officer Krumke. I don't believe they're depraved because my mind just wouldn't go there.
No, I understand that. I don't disagree with you. It goes back to what this gentleman said before. I don't necessarily disagree with you. But it is a shocking thesis.
Oh, yeah.
It's a shocking thesis to come to the realization, according to her, that may not have had anything to do with Mr. Lincoln.
They both drew attention by being dead wrong.
Yes. Oh yes. Oh yes. He was willing to take that chance. He was willing to take that chance. I mean, the whole business of leaping to the floor of the Sic Semper Tyrannis and everything else, he's putting on a show. He's putting on a performance.
No question about that.
For what purpose? Yes, ma'am, in the back.
As far as you know, and all that research you were doing, apparently his background never came to the fore in any books that were written.
Apparently, the question of his motivation, as far as his brother was concerned, was not addressed. Now, I'll tell you a story. His brother controls the message, okay? After the assassination, his brother is me, me, me. What has this done to me? He has ruined my family. He has ruined my career. He leaves the theater. Oh, I must leave the theater. What has my brother done? And comes back 6 months later and just takes off. But he controls the message. From the time of the assassination until Edwin dies in 1893, 28 years, Edwin is powerful enough to control the message. There's very little discussion of John Wilkes Booth. There's very little discussion of their family. There's very little discussion of anything as long as Edwin is alive. They have a sister, Asia, who writes a biography, and he won't let it be printed. It's not printed until after he's dead. And the amazing thing is, by doing that, by suppressing the message the way he did, when he finally died and the cover came off, that's when you got all of this story about the great actor John Wilkes Booth. You get this great strike a blow for the Confederacy. You get all of these messages. And of course, it's 1893, 1894. You're playing with the Confederacy, doing their lost cause routine, and you get into all of these myths. And she talks about that. She says there was myth-making about John Wilkes Booth. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Man was dead and buried. They tried and hanged the conspirators, what? He was shot in April and they were dead in July. we went to see that movie, The Conspirator, you know, with Mary Surratt. I said to my wife, the only thing that's missing in this courtroom are the tracks, the railroad tracks. I mean, you know where she's going. She's going straight to the gallows because they just wanted to get it behind them. They just wanted to bury them all, get it over with, move on. And he did too. He did too. Edwin would not allow you to discuss his brother in his presence. And yet when he died, he had a beautiful home in Gramercy Park down in New York City, and he converted the first 2 floors eventually into a club called the Players Club for actors, and he lived upstairs. And when he died in 1893, at 59 years old, he had all of these pictures on the wall and all of this stuff, and right next to his bed was a picture of his brother. It's the only picture next to his bed was his brother. I think he knew. I think he's on a guilt trip for years after, when he realized the way he had suppressed his career. It's a fascinating story in that he has so much power. Money is power. And he has so much power that he will not allow his brother to act in the same town where he has acted or is going to act. And he divides the country in half in 1860. And guess what he uses as the dividing line? Mason-Dixon line. And John Wilkes Booth can go south, and Edwin can go north. And the only reason he's in Albany in February of '61 is because Edwin's out of the country. With Edwin out of the country, the happiest time of John Wilkes Booth's life is when Edwin was out of the country, from about 61 to about 62 or 63, because then he could do. When Edwin came back in 63, he dropped the hammer. No, you can't. And he had the power. He had that power. And he used it. And he refused to assist or mentor his brother in any way, shape, or form. Yes, ma'am?
How does she deal, if she insists that it's a sibling rivalry thing, with the fact that there were all these other people who were supposed to be out also killing people, and I mean, they got Seward.
Right. Payne goes after Seward. Azerrad is supposed to go shoot Johnson and chickens out and goes down to the bar.
Yeah,
the whole assassination thing, how does she deal with it?
Doesn't
mention.
Oh, well then.
There you go. Don't bring it up. The focus is narrow. The focus is what drove him. And if he brings these other people in, that's his power.
Is that what you referred to as the cult?
Yes. He's running a crew. He's got quite the crew.
So this is his ego.
Well, yeah. And you throw in 2 meetings with the Confederate Secret Service, one in New Orleans in '64 and one in Montreal in early '65, and just stirs the mix. Goes back to what this gentleman said before. Don't for 1 minute. If I'm giving you the impression that politics and race has nothing to do with this, no, don't get that impression. The point she's trying to make is that the foundation for all of this comes because of the relationship or lack of a relationship with his brother. And everything else is an add-on, okay? But it does play a part. Oh my God, you couldn't live. How could you live from 1860 to 1865 without some kind of politics or race or anything having an effect on you? But depending on the background, depending on where you come from, depending on your foundation, dictates, I guess, how you deal with that. The interesting thing is his family were strict egalitarians. They hired blacks in the 1840s and the 1850s, and this is in Western Maryland, and did not believe in slavery at any time at all, the father and the mother. Now the father, God bless the terminology, but he's something else. I won't say he's crazy as a loon, because that's not, you can't go there. Don't do that to somebody. But he's got some seriously strange beliefs for that period. And he's a very, very intense individual. But he's also egalitarian, and he hires blacks. He does not have slaves. So, I don't know, where does that go?
All right.
No, in the back. Yes, sir.
It's already been covered a couple. I was going to say that psychohistory is interesting, but I think I agree with you that it can be very limited.
Sure.
He was a 26-year-old, probably accurately called clinically, mentally ill. I think a couple gentlemen. And as you mentioned, the book really glosses over the conspiracy. There's no explanation of sibling rivalry with all the other conspirators. So I believe I agree with you that it's limited. It's interesting. Psychohistory but it's limited in terms of motivation.
One thing I would say, though, I think I don't know if it's dangerous or if it's fair to say that someone is insane unless you have an official diagnosis. I had a history professor 1,000 years ago who would get very upset when you would simply say, and the example he used was Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Oh, they're crazy. And just dismiss them out of hand because, oh, they're crazy. No. There's a lot more to it than that. I don't think John Wilkes Booth was crazy. I think he was wrong. Goes back to what he said. I think he was wrong, but I don't think he was crazy.
My second question, I enjoyed your presentation. I also saw Nora's C-SPAN.
Okay.
She's an attractive lady and can be persuasive if you listen to her. But the other issue you raised at the beginning is that the book, the psychohistory, it denigrates the role of Lincoln or the importance of Lincoln.
Diminish is the word I use.
And historians always have him in the top 5 or the top 3. I'm more inclined, if you read some revisionism of Lincoln, to have more of a nuanced perspective on Lincoln. But if you look at motivation for Booth, and if it wasn't his brother, if there was some other motivation to revenge the South losing the Civil War, if Booth had read or listened to Lincoln's second inaugural, which I believe is a very excellent speech on bringing the South, reconciling the South without revenge. But wouldn't you agree that what Booth did in terms of the assassination is pave the way for the radical Republicans to militarily take over the South? So Booth's action was totally counterproductive.
Absolutely. And don't forget, Booth was at the second inaugural. There's a picture of Booth who swears up and down to his dear friend Surratt that he had a clean shot right then and there from up and above. But getting back to what you said about reconciliation, goes back to my question about why does he wait till Friday, the 14th, to shoot the president? There was this plot to kidnap Lincoln. I don't know how much you've read about this and so on and so forth, but there was talk of kidnapping Lincoln and exchanging him for the Confederate prisoners that were held at, I believe it was Oak Point. Okay, this was in late of 1864, and they butchered the deal. Lincoln wasn't where he was supposed to be, and they gave it up. And he doesn't come back to the issue of what to do about Lincoln until after the war's over. Well, one of the biggest problems is, according to her, is he has this investment in western Pennsylvania on the oil wells, and he goes belly up. So there's this gap in time. I mean, if you fail to kidnap the president in in August of 1864, before Sherman takes Atlanta, before the re-election, why didn't he shoot him then? Okay, I'm being cold here. Why does he wait until the 14th? It's too late. There is no Richmond, right? Richmond has fallen. Lee has surrendered. It's over. What is the purpose? What is he hoping to accomplish?
Revenge.
There's revenge. There's definitely a revenge motive. Absolutely. Absolutely. You can't deny the revenge motive. But according to Ms. Titone, it comes back to an issue of, I have to strike now, or the moment will be lost. Okay? I have to strike, otherwise it's not going to mean anything. Okay? If he waits till, May, June, July. The decision to assassinate the president isn't made until Friday morning, when he goes to pick up his mail at Ford's Theater. And Ford tells him Lincoln and Grant are coming to the theater tonight. And it's like somebody turned on a light. And he races back and gathers his troops. And it's all put together. And he goes back to the theater and sets the box up so that he can gain access to the box and set the wood, block the door. You know the plot. You know the story. And then shoots the man, leaps 12 feet to the stage, makes his speech, and goes out the back door. But the decision to assassinate is it's like boom, all at once. Yes, ma'am.
You tell us that his father hires black people.
Yes.
Where does John Booth come in there? I don't put two and two together. Lincoln was against slavery. His father was against slavery. Where was John in that?
John was a white supremacist. John belonged to the Know Nothing Party in 1854, which was against immigration. John was getting verbally abused a lot because of the fact that mom and dad were not married at the time that he was born. He was being, there was a lot of give and take going on in the neighborhood, and he got some abuse from some Irish. And you know about those Irish. You got to watch those Irish. Well, part of the Know Nothing policy, anti-immigration, and this is at 16, and he begins to develop this attitude about he's anti-black, he's anti-immigrant, he's anti-everything. Because no matter what happens, no matter what they say about him, he's still a white male. Okay, they can put him down as deep as they want to. He's still a white male. So that puts him at least not on the bottom of the social stratus. He's up at least one level. So, and this whole attitude develops as well. This whole anti-black, anti-Irish, anti-immigration. He makes a promise to his mother not to enlist in the Confederate Army because he was ready to go. He was ready to go 20 minutes after Fort Sumter.
He didn't agree with his father.
Oh, no. He loved his father. His father was dead by, 1855 or something. Are we good?
Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you all very much for coming.